What's up, guys? I wanted to link some studies, some things that I've looked at over the years that will kind of help you guys understand my thought process as to why I kind of implement contrast training and why I think it's effective for most people. And it covers a lot of bases that traditional sports science, with at least the way programming principles and periodization are, don't necessarily get at, especially for the everyday average person or even an athlete that's aging. I'm using these two exercises I did as an example. So a heavy dumbbell row, right? We're trying to go as heavy as possible. We're trying to recruit as many motor units and muscle fibers as possible until we reach exhaustion. I particularly like rest pause sets with these. You can tell I did like 10 or 15 reps, pause, squeaked out another 5 reps on each side. I just think you'll see here in a little bit, it is a very good example of what we call myofibrillar packing, right? So when we talk about hypertrophy, we're talking about sarcoplasmic or myofibrillar hypertrophy. Myofibrillar packing is important because basically it incentivizes us to go as heavy as possible, keep the reps relatively short so that way we can prioritize load, and really focus on, particularly the eccentric or isometric of the movement, and work on basically what Cal Dietz has popularized is triphasic training and the ripping of myosin and actin heads and tissue remodeling, so that way we can have more propensity for type 2 fibers and basically more potential when it comes to rate coding, which is simply put more potential for action with how quickly you can basically use neuromuscular synchronization in athletic movements. So if you are stronger, there's just a bigger cross bridge for your body to use to perform more tasks more repeatedly, etc. So I put a picture of that there, and what you're looking at is obviously the higher the muscular force, the higher potential you have for that firing rate. It's a pretty simple concept. We all do that in some form or fashion. There's a fine art to it with momentum lifting versus actual explosive good technique and good execution of a clean pull or an Olympic lift or a hex bar jump or whatever. But where this starts to delineate a little bit is when you start talking about fascia. Everybody's familiar with post-activation potentiation or the basically potentiation effect. Pre-training our tissue can be a little squishy, and then post-training session it's going to have more stiffness, which is good for reducing things like ground contact time and improving elasticity, especially when talking about connective tissues and fascia. So it's definitely incorporating contrast training is one of those ways that we can start to highlight those tissues. When we look at this next slide, we're basically looking at how the tendon and muscles work in relation. So I couldn't get the whole picture in there, but essentially what happens is during muscular work, the muscle, agonist, antagonist contracts and shortens depending on where the lever on the fulcrum is, and then that connective tissue property stays relatively the same to keep everything balanced and even. Some people call that tensegrity. With elastic movements, though, what happens is actually the muscle stays rather isometric, and the tissue is what actually expands and contracts. So doing some of these rapid, light, high velocity exercises can help train that tissue quality. When we look at a younger, healthier, basically fascially fit tissue, it looks like a nice crossweave after enough time of repetitive loading patterns, or also too just lack of use of the elastic nature of these tissues. We can have this disorganized or basically matted fascial tissue and what they call adhesions. You can certainly train this quality. It takes rapid loading, velocity, omnidirectional movement, and obviously too a little bit of attention to detail. There's some other qualities that we could get into, but we're not trying to get too deep into the fascia. We just want to look at how they interact with basically muscular firing and movement sequencing, especially when we're talking about training. So when we look at these properties side by side, one of the diagrams I'm showing you next is going to help make a little bit more sense of the different types of exercises. So you have, basically that myofibral in a relaxed position, like at rest. You have it doing, a typical lift, a usual muscle work, and then you have it during a lengthened state. So, a classic hamstring stretch versus an actively loaded stretch might be a hamstring rebound. If we're using the dumbbell exercise, in this case, the B diagram is the heavy dumbbell row, and the plyometric with the dumbbell and shoulder flexion and shoulder extension is the actively loaded stretch. So I know a lot of times there was some research that conflicted with bouncing or ballistic stretching, but if you watch any high-level Olympic athlete, especially like a thrower or something like that, there's quite a bit of actively loaded stretch of exercises where they're actively loading that stretch shortening cycle. If you've ever seen a aggressive reactive medicine ball throw from a javelin thrower, some of the reverse throws they do, all of these things are how they prepare their connective tissue to perform at a high level. So as a athlete pursuing excellence, or whether you're just a person who's trying to make your joints feel better, you need some type of dynamic ballistic loading in to keep your joint maximally healthy. With that being said, typical gym culture encourages what we consider sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, right? High volume training, the emphasis on physique and aesthetics over actual function. If you train properly, though, you can get a good bit of both of these adaptations. It's just the tricky part is knowing how to blend it with some of these connective tissue properties. If you see this diagram here has the sarcomeres and the fascicles. Probably pronounced that wrong, but basically is that intermatrix gel or interfascicular matrix. It needs some specific exercises that are going to help target that. Now, if you're playing a sport, you probably don't have to do as much of this unless you're trying to peak and really get faster in a specific neuromuscular pattern. But for most of us, we just need a little bit of general ballistic dynamic contracting and relaxing in order to maximize what these myosin and actin filaments do when we lift weights, but then transferring it over into axonal usable tissue with how it connects to, say, our shoulder labrum, our hip labrum, or any of the other tendons and ligaments that we come across in certain movements. We think of a jump or a squat, we think of a patella or quad tendon, those types of things. So anyways, I just wanted to say thank you guys. Just definitely put my thoughts out here. I'm not claiming to be right about all of them, but for me, some of the articles that I'll link below are going to be beneficial if you're on the fence about doing any kind of dynamic contrast intra-set work. Definitely reach out to either my Instagram or YouTube page, and let's talk shop.